Okay, great. Well, welcome to everyone who's watching now, and welcome to everyone who's going to watch this at some point in the future. It feels very strange to be doing a season announcement right now. It feels strange, and it also feels honestly a little bit. I feel a little bit of guilt associated with it. I'm kind of keenly aware that many groups have already canceled for the week of our projected opening concert, and the realities of the situation are what they are. It seems at this point probably pretty likely that we won't be able to present our entire season exactly as planned. And we will be working as information becomes clearer over the next month on what we can do to present as much of it as possible and in whatever way makes the most sense. But I think it's important to show what we're working towards and how we want to stay active in the community, to affirm our commitment to the community and to present this music in whatever form we can and is safe for everybody. Obviously, safety is paramount. I've been so thankful this week for our essential workers. From obviously the healthcare workers to the grocery workers, everyone who's making our lives still happen in this scary time. And obviously the best way we can support them is to all minimize our risk as much as possible. So I want to tell you a little bit about the season that we have planned, and especially about some of the less familiar composers. For me, there's always such a great joy in presenting well-known masterworks and new music, but also, I think, especially brilliant music that's been largely forgotten or is much less frequently heard. And sometimes that's music by obscure composers, and sometimes it's by famous ones. So let's start off with our June lineup, and I will go through and try not to talk too extensively about each of these things, but I am pretty excited, provisionally. So, in June, we have 2 village concerts projected and 1 club concert that we're doing in kind of a non-traditional venue. So our first village concert is with a woodwind quartet, and you probably have heard woodwinds in quintet formation many times. You may not have heard a woodwind quartet, but it's a slightly more intimate and absolutely fabulous ensemble of players. That is flute, clarinet, oboe, and bassoon. And so we begin the woodwind quartet concert with Mozart's Fantasia in F minor, his piano Fantasia, K608, beautifully arranged, works great for wind quartet. There's a piece by Eugene Botza for clarinet and bassoon, and Botza is a fascinating figure. He was a French composer and violinist, lived through most of the 20th century, died, I believe, in 1991. And, whereas most violinist composers write for violin, or almost exclusively for violin, Botza wrote a significant amount of music for strings, including a tour de force unaccompanied cello piece, which is how I got to know his music, and operas and symphonies. But he was also an incredibly prolific writer of music for wind ensembles, chamber and solo music, band music, other works for large brass and woodwind ensembles. And so I think that's actually how he's best known now, is as a composer for wind instruments. Then we have Frank Bridge's Divertamenti for woodwind quartet. Bridge was Britten's teacher, of course, and frequent attendees of our concerts over the past few years will know how much I love Bridge. We've done his Idylls for string quartet, which Britten actually took as the theme for his magnificent theme and variations for string orchestra. And we've presented his Fantasy Quartet for strings, and a couple years ago we did the Fantasy for piano trio in C minor, which is still just one of my favorite pieces. I love Bridge, and so I try to play his music whenever I can, or to program his music whenever I can. And these Divertamenti for woodwind quintet are so glorious and so beautiful and so much fun. Then there is a little sonata by W.F. Bach, that's Wilhelm Friedemann Bach. It was originally written for 2 flutes, but it works so beautifully for flute and oboe. There is a wind quartet by Karl Göpfart, whose name I'm not entirely sure I'm pronouncing correctly, but I'm going to go with Göpfart. He was a pupil of Liszt, an army musician, choral conductor. It's such an effervescent, gorgeous work. and I was very, very excited to hear it. And then we end this first concert with the Arthur Berger Quartet in C major for woodwinds. Arthur Berger, notable American composer, died in the early 2000s. We often think of his post-serialist work based around kind of cerebral ideas of pitch class clusters, but he also wrote a fair bit of neoclassical music, including this very, very effective quartet for woodwinds, which is bright and fun and just really, really sparkly and kind of goofy. Then at our club concert in Keene, New Hampshire, we have this wonderful vocal cello fiddling duo, cross-genre, kind of folk, all sorts of things, called Ari and Mia. Ari and Mia is aka Ariel and Mia Friedman. They're billed as New England's Americana sister act. They're two virtuosic, passionate musicians with conservatory training. They both went to New England Conservatory for degrees in contemporary improv, and they're both highly acclaimed songwriters. I've known Ariel for some time through the freelance circuit in Boston. Mia, so far, I know only through hearing recordings online, but I've been so moved and so delighted by their work. If you want to check them out online, you can go to their website, which is ariandmiamusic.com, all one long word, or you can simply do a web search for Ari and Mia. It's going to be a very special event, and I can't wait to hear it. The final village concert in June is in Jaffrey, New Hampshire, and it is music for 4 cellos. And anyone who has ever heard 4 cellos play all together without any other sort of intervening instruments knows how glorious that sound is. I think it's one of the few ensembles that, like, cellists love it so much, but also I think audiences do too. You know, it's not just simply a self-indulgent pleasure, fortunately. I started putting together music for 4 cellos, and at first it was a bit of a challenge because it's a fairly niche idiom. You know, what's best known today is a handful of pieces by romantic pedagogues like Klengel, nothing against Klengel, and a bunch of arrangements, and there's just not that vast a repertoire for cello quartet. But as I dug a little deeper, I found more and more amazing music for this combination, and I actually ended up with far too much repertoire that I really wanted to play to fit on one concert program. So some of it I'm going to have to save for a later date, but the program that I came up with is one that I think is really so fun and so beautiful. We begin with an arrangement that I'm doing of Couperin's Barricades Mystérieuses, which is a piece I've always just loved. It has such cool textures, and I remember hearing it, for the nth time a few years ago and thinking, wow, this would really sound very cool as a 4 cello piece. And it actually works remarkably well. It's almost completely strict to 4-part writing, even though it has this kind of arpeggiated texture constantly. So then we have 2 pieces by Wilhelm Fitzenhagen, his Ave Maria, and his, what's the other piece called? It is Concert Waltzes. Fitzenhagen was a notable German cellist. He was a composer and teacher. And here's a fun digression. He also taught Joseph Adamowski, who was an important figure in the turn-of-the-century Boston cultural scene. He was part of the then very well-known ensembles, the Adamowski Trio and the Adamowski String Quartet, and also one of the very first musicians of the Boston Symphony. His brother Timothy actually conducted the Boston Pops and taught at NEC as well. So Fitzenhagen maybe is best known today because he was the dedicatee of Tchaikovsky's very famous Rococo variations. And so Fitzenhagen premiered this piece. He changed the sequence of the variations and he left a couple of them out. And he also made some technical alterations. And Tchaikovsky was apparently so irate with the scope of these changes. But he ultimately allowed the piece to be published with Fitzenhagen's modifications. So he can't have been too angry. Or maybe he just recognized that that it worked great that way. You know, it got me thinking a little bit about, I was looking at a manuscript for the Dvorak Concerto recently because I have a student who is working through the piece, and it's really amazing to go to the manuscript and see how many iconic passages in pieces like this are so different when they were originally conceived. Much clunkier, much kind of less easy to execute, and much less effective. And, you know, when you think of some of the great romantic composers who worked with their kind of colleague performers like Brahms and Joachim and other iconic duos of the great Romantic literature. It really kind of brings home the role that performers, I think, have always played in shaping these pieces. So that's interesting. Fitzenhagen. Then we have two movements for cello quartet by Alexander Tonsman, who is a Polish-French composer, lived through most of the 20th century. Like so many creative artists of his generation, he fled Europe in the early 1940s, and he came to LA actually thanks to Charlie Chaplin's efforts to secure him a visa. He wrote a few film scores, one of which was nominated for an Oscar for Best Music in 1946. And it's so beautiful. I heard a recording of this piece and was just blown away. Then we have Alan Shawn's Suite for Cello Quartet. Alan Shawn lives in Vermont. He teaches at Bennington. He's written books on Schoenberg and Bernstein, as well as more autobiographical books, which explore very frankly his experiences with anxiety and panic disorder, and also his relationship with his autistic twin sister. He's a really beautiful composer. I was very taken when I heard this piece with his cello quartet, which feels also very honest and forthright to me in its compositional language. And then we have a piece by Jane Antonia Cornish, a very short little piece, but really so striking. She is an English composer based in New York. She has written and orchestrated for films, including Kung Fu Panda and Maleficent, which I thought was really cool. Her chamber music, though, it's so remarkable. It's, this piece in particular, I think, explores sonority and sound and silence in a really remarkable way. It's very dramatic. It opens with this huge kind of outcry cadenza from the first cellist, and then goes on to this kind of disintegrating texture. So it's very, very beautiful. And then we end the cello quartet program with a suite by Emanuel Moore. And Emanuel Moore was a fascinating figure, a Hungarian composer, pianist, but he wrote extensively for cello. And he worked very closely with Casals, who was a strong proponent of his music. He also was an inventor who designed several musical instruments. His best-known invention during his lifetime was a double manual piano that would allow a pianist to reach 2 octaves with one hand. And there were actually double manual pianos manufactured according to this design, his design, by Pleyel and Bösendorfer and Steinway and Chickering. It was a fairly short-lived, kind of fad, but it actually had some very strong proponents. Ravel was apparently very impressed with this design, and he said that the Emanuel Moore pianoforte produced the sounds that he had actually intended in some of his works, but that were simply impossible to produce on a conventional piano. So that's a very cool piece. In July, we begin with an outdoor band concert and picnic in Harrisville, and this is a tradition that we've had for a couple years now. This year, we are scheduled to be at Aldworth Manor, and we're featuring the award-winning quintet and local favorite Beacon Brass, 5 of Boston's most notable brass players. They play with the symphony, the pops, and ballet, and all the major groups in town, and together they're just magical. I remember the first time that I ever heard brass quintet, it was at a summer camp when I was a kid. It was probably some 5-part madrigal, some arrangement. And that majestic, mournful sound was like nothing I'd ever heard before. It was like Jacopo Belbo's trumpet and Foucault's pendulum, but times 5. I also remember the trombone was my favorite, so shout out to all the trombonists out there. And then we have, after the 4th of July, we have a Salon Concert, which is music for 2 violins. And I put this program together to demonstrate the virtuosity and the amiability of my absolute favorite instrument, which is the violin. So we begin with Talamon's Gulliver Suite. Oh, I wonder if I have this music. Yes, just a second. So Talamon's Gulliver Suite is a fun, kind of gallant little piece with some very erudite music notational humor. One movement, for example, is the Lilliputian chaconne, which is to be played in a sort of normal, moderate chaconne tempo. But Talamon, as you can see, notates it in 3/32. I don't know if you can see that clearly framed. So the basic unit of pulse is the wee tiny 32nd note, which is played actually quite slowly. So most of the movement actually consists of 64th notes and 128th notes. And you won't hear that really in the performance. It sounds like kind of a normal, if maybe somewhat lightweight chaconne. It's sort of a joke really intended for the performers. But we also have a Dignashian Jig, which you can see is kind of the opposite. It is notated in whole notes with a couple of brevs thrown in there. So the time signature is 24-1. Again, a very unusual time signature in, well, any music. And each whole note goes by very, very quickly. And then the piece ends with a graceful louret of the well-mannered, boy, I don't even know how to pronounce this, the Hunyhymns, which is played in the first violin part at the same time as the wild frenzy of the untamed yahoos. So it's a very charming and humorous piece and a lot of fun. Then we move to Grazina Bachevich's Suite for 2 violins. Bachevich is one of the most notable Polish composers. She lived until, I think, 1969. She was an accomplished violinist and wrote many, many brilliant works for the violin, lots of chamber and orchestral music as well. And she wrote 7-string quartets as well as a quartet for 4 violins and a quartet for 4 cellos. So always exploring kind of slightly less traditional sonorities. This suite for 2 violins is one of my favorite pieces of hers. It's fiery and clever and graceful and just brilliantly effective in its writing for the violin. And then we have a selection from Isai's Sonata for 2 violin. And Isai has always been kind of one of my heroes. He was one of the legendary figures of the early 20th century violin world. His 6 unaccompanied sonatas are monoliths of virtuoso technique, but also, I think, of the soul of the violin, and they become absolutely canonized in the literature. Like the great virtuosi before and after him, Paganini, Sarasate, Wieniawski, Bachevich, he wrote mostly for the violin, with a few notable exceptions. But his sonata is dark and passionate and gorgeous, and it has that kind of Fritz Kreisler era sensibility and charm, and I absolutely adore it. Then we have Angelica Negron's Tres Insultos, or 3 Insults, for 2 violins, which I think is just such a great title. She's a Puerto Rican-born composer with a sense of whimsy and unconventional creativity. Her bio says that she writes music for accordions, robotic instruments, toys, and electronics, as well as chamber ensembles and orchestras. And I think that encapsulates perfectly what I love about her music. The 3 Insults for 2 violins are a brief but imaginative way to contextualize the dialogue between 2 similar voices. And the last piece on the program is Louis Spohr's Duo Concertante, Opus 67, number 2, in D major. And Spohr, is perhaps not thought of today by most musicians and audience members as anything other than one of the many, perhaps, overly conservative members in the pantheon of 19th century German composers. But during his lifetime, he was very highly regarded for his composition and his conducting, as well as for his violin playing and his contributions to modern violin pedagogy. Spohr, there's this story with Spohr and Liszt that I was trying to look up the details on because I wanted to make sure I had it right, and I couldn't find it anywhere. But my recollection, so Spohr and Liszt both were very early champions of Wagner as conductors, and Liszt programmed a lot of Spohr's music. And the story that I remember is that when Liszt was, I think he was on tour, and he programmed a concert where he presented 2 chamber pieces. I want to say they were maybe trios, one by Beethoven and one by Spohr. And in the program, he reversed them and presented the Beethoven as written by Spohr and the Spohr as written by Beethoven. It's kind of a little joke on the audience. And as he expected, the audience sort of ho-hummed their way through the Beethoven, which they thought was Spohr, and they applauded wildly for the Spohr, which they thought was Beethoven. And I don't know, whatever that says to you. I think that, I don't think anybody would argue that Spohr achieved the greatness of Beethoven in any respect. But his music is really beautiful and very worth revisiting. And I'm so excited to present this piece. I first heard it recently, and I was so taken with its warmth and its grace, as well as its pyrotechnical feats. So it's one that I absolutely can't wait to hear. All right, moving along. I'll try to get through these without too much taking too much time. Let's see. So our next village concert is in Wilton for soprano, tenor, and piano. And I have to say this was maybe the most fun concert to put together on the entire season. Just exploring that repertoire. Both, there are a few kind of single songs for just soprano and piano or tenor and piano, but then many where they sing together. And, there's such beautiful repertoire. So the first thing is Beethoven's 4 arias and a duet, which is written very much in the kind of Italianate operatic style. Really, really fun. Just absolutely so colorful and so delightful and flowery. There's an early work of Messiaen, L'amour d'une ombre, which also features a beautiful violin obbligato, and a set of songs by Anne Carse, Cawrse, an Australian composer living in Adelaide. These songs are called parting songs, and they're just very touching and heartfelt. Then we have Schumann's 4 duets, his duets opus 78. Schumann, of course, one of the most remarkably original and provocative writers of vocal music. These duets are a little lighter than the songs we know from his earlier cycles, but they're so charming and so gorgeous. And there are 2 songs from Liza Lemon's Daisy Chain. Liza Lemon was an English operatic singer and composer. After her retirement from the stage, she focused on composition, and she also accompanied her own songs on the piano in concert tours. She was the first president of the Society of Women Musicians in the early 1910s, and she was a professor at the Guildhall School of Music. And most of her songs are lighthearted and humorous and fun and quite beautiful. These 2 songs are from the Daisy Chain, which is a set of children's songs on poetry by various authors, including, most notably, Robert Louis Stevenson from his well-beloved Child's Garden of Verses. And I believe that of the 2 songs that I've selected, one of those is by Stevenson. And I don't remember the other poet's name off the top of my head. And then we end with Darren Hagen's cycle called Afterwards, which is a remarkable set described by the composer as a symposium between 2 ethereal beings on the nature of art and love. It begins with a reflection on Schubert's final song in the cycle Winterreise, Der Leiermann, which interweaves Schubert's music with Hagen's and moves to questions of where an artist's voice originates, the nature of song, and the endless nature of love. So all the little things, It's a very powerful modern song cycle by an incredibly lyrical and poetic composer, and I can't wait to hear it live. All right, moving along to Dublin's Village Concert, which is for mezzo-soprano, viola, cello, and piano. Some programs start with a single piece from which the rest of the concept and the concert just kind of ends up emanating. And for this concert, that was Frank Bridges' 3 songs for mezzo, viola, and piano, which is, of course, kind of an answer to Brahms's 2 songs for the same instrumentation. And when I heard them, I knew I had to build a program around them somehow. So the pieces that I chose to kind of offset these within that, within mostly that instrumentation, I also allowed myself to add cello in some places. We begin with a piece by Carolyn Shaw called Limestone and Felt. And Carolyn has been a huge name in contemporary classical music ever since she won the Pulitzer Prize in 2013 at age 30. She's a violinist, a singer. She performs with the cutting-edge a cappella group Roomful of Teeth, which I've been privileged to play with a couple of times. And Limestone and Felt explores contrasting surfaces, hard and soft, resonant and muted, new and old. And like all of her music, it's very striking and profoundly honest. Then we have Witold Lutoslawski's 5 Bucolics for viola and cello, which is rambunctious and folksy and fun. There's a lot of fun, I always try to look for fun music. And then the bridge songs that I mentioned, absolutely gorgeous, so chocolatey. And then selections from 2 sets, one by Bernard Rands and the other by Juliana Hall, both for mezzo-soprano and cello. And, that combination is so striking, just voice and cello, because it's kind of very pure, distilled textures, and you have this contrast between a sung voice and a wordless voice. So, really remarkable pieces both. And then we end with the Brahms Clarinet Trio, which is one of the staples of the Romantic repertoire, one of Brahms's last pieces that he ever composed. And it's here presented in its alternate form with viola in place of clarinet. I've played this piece so many times with clarinet, and it's always absolutely gorgeous. But I have to say I'm really curious to experience it with viola, which is a, it was published with a viola alternate, and it's not super frequently done, or rarely done, but I think it's going to be quite effective. All right, moving along to Keene. Mid-July Keene Village Concert. This is a piano plus string trio, aka piano quartet concert. And we begin with a piece by Johann Christian Bach, his piano quartet in G major. And every time I hear a piece by J.C. Bach, I'm kind of blown away, and I wonder why I don't play his music so much more frequently. I recently listened to one of his oboe quartets, and it was so gorgeous and so remarkable. And this piano quartet also is absolutely beautiful, and I can't wait to play it. Then we have a piece by Missy Masoli called Lies You Can Believe In. Missy Masoli is Grammy nominated. She's one of the first women to be ever commissioned by the Met, which I think happened in 2018, shockingly recently, and just dazzlingly eclectic. This short piece is arresting and brilliant. She writes that lies here is to be taken in the sense of a story that's improvised and embellished, not a malicious untruth. And she also writes the piece is inspired by modern gypsy music and punk and electronica as much as it is by traditional Bulgarian and Romanian folk music. Super fun piece. We have Pierre Jalbert's string trio. We presented one of his piano trios a couple years back to great reception. I always love playing his music, because it's both beautifully structured and so well thought out, but also just profoundly sonorous and genuine. And then we end with the Fauré G minor piano quartet. And this Fauré quartet has always been one of my favorites, from the very middle of his period, halfway between the early French Romanticism of his youth and the aesthetic, visionary, more meditative, and in some ways less traditionally goal-oriented music associated with the end of his life. And you can hear the pull of both creative impulses in this quartet, and it creates an absolutely exquisite and complex style, deeply romantic and timeless, I think, as well. Then we have a piano trio concert in Hancock with three amazing pieces. The Niels Wilhelm Gade piano trio in F major. Gade was a 19th century Danish composer. He was a conductor as well, a violinist, and an organist. And I played several of his pieces lately and have been so smitten with the just effortless, natural lyricism of his voice. And this trio is warm and autumnal and just incredibly luscious. Then we have the Typher piano trio. She was a French composer, one of the group known as Les Six, and Les Six was kind of considered to be a reactionary consortium of composers who rejected the Wagnerian tradition continued by composers like Mahler and Strauss, as well as the impressionistic style that was exemplified by Debussy. But it's funny, Mio, who was one of the members of Les Six, writes that really the group was in fact formed kind of arbitrarily by the critic and composer Henri Collet, who was not one of the group members, by the way, and founded simply on the basis that these six composers knew each other and they were pals and they appeared on the same musical programs, and despite the fact that they had very different drives and ideologies. But in any case, Typher is, I think, one of the more neglected members of Les Six. We presented her gorgeous string quartet 2 years ago, and I'm really excited to play her piano trio, which is quite virtuosic and very neoclassical and fun. And then we end this program with the Smetana piano trio in G minor. And the Smetana it's a strange and remarkable piece. It was written as an outpouring of grief after the death of his 4-year-old daughter to scarlet fever. And it was condemned by contemporary critics, and it's not too hard to understand why. It can come across, I think, as a bit of a bewildering jumble of disconnected ideas. But after all, music, like life, is not always sensibly ordered, and it is a powerful and a profoundly moving testament to love and loss. And one of the piano trio's few contemporary admirers, by the way, was Franz Liszt. There's always kind of a through line of Liszt this season, even though we're not actually playing any Liszt. For me, everything always comes back to Liszt. And at the end of July, we have scheduled our James Bully Memorial Concert, our beloved founder of Monadnock Music, who passed away quite recently. And we are scheduled to present Beethoven's Ninth Symphony in the Peterborough Townhouse with Gil Rose conducting. That would be Sunday, July 26th. So we are hoping and praying that that can go on as scheduled. And then our last concert in July, getting to the end now almost, is a village concert in Deering, music for flute and harp. And this is also a fun kind of repertoire to go through and explore. I came with a bunch of short pieces by Jacques Ibert, by Boston's beloved John Heiss, who is... I guess he's retired from NEC now, but he's still very much involved with the community there. By the American composer and flautist Catherine Hoover, who died about a year and a half ago, a piece called Dances and Variations. And there's a piece by the early 20th century Dutch composer Samuel Dresden, gorgeous, gorgeous sonata for flute and harp. A short piece by Donizetti, a piece by Kaya Sarajevo, who is really, I think, one of the preeminent sculptors of our age of pure sound and deconstructed sonority, but also with this great gift for lyrical writing. That piece is called Tokar. And then ending with a piece by Lowell Lieberman, Sonata for Flute and Harp. And we did his piano trio several years ago, and I remember just being really taken by the kind of, the sort of effortless, what would you call it? Just impressionism of it. It was very beautiful. It felt very modern, but also incredibly comforting. Gorgeous music. All right, and then a couple of concerts in August. Getting down to it, Francistown. We have a concert for clarinet and string quartet. We're presenting one of Mozart's last quartets. That is the string quartet in B-flat major, K589, one of my favorites. A piece by Nicola Lafanu. She is a British composer, and she is also the daughter of the noted Irish-English composer Elizabeth McConkey, whose third string quartet we presented last year on, I believe, our final concert. This piece is called Invisible Places for clarinet and string quartet, and it's inspired by Italo Calvino's book Invisible Cities. It's 16 miniature movements, all told about 12 minutes long, made up of many small contrasting ideas that are in constant transformation. It's really absolutely so beautiful. I love the idea of fragments, and I think that's one that's really mined by so many composers in such a beautiful way. And then ending this concert with Bernard Herrmann's Souvenir de Voyage for clarinet and string quartet. And Bernard Herrmann is, of course, known and celebrated for his film scores, particularly those of Hitchcock. Psycho and Vertigo are probably his most famous, but many others as well. And Souvenir de Voyage is his last concert piece. It was written in 1967, and it's contemplative and atmospheric and darkly mysterious and just, utterly gorgeous. I love it so much. Then we have our first string quartet concert in Nelson, which is in its entirety the Haydn Seven Last Words of Christ. And, I wanted to program the Seven Last Words this season long before the world went completely mad, and it feels like an especially timely solace now. The piece is fascinating. It's sort of inception. In 1786, Haydn was commissioned to write instrumental music on the Seven Last Words of Christ on the cross, and this is, of course, not 7 literal words, but 7 utterances. The first word being Pater dimite illis, quia nesciunt, quid faciunt. Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. And the last, of course, in manus tuas, Domine, commendo spiritum meum, which needs no translation. And Haydn writes of the difficulty in composing 7 successive adagios lasting almost 10 minutes each, which he then bookended with a slow magisterial introduction and a concluding earthquake, Il Terremoto, where the fury and tumult that's been suppressed for the previous hour bursts forth violently. And the following year, he adapted it for string quartet. He wrote it originally as this kind of grand orchestral work. He adapted it for string quartet, which is perhaps the version in which it's most frequently heard today. Later also as an oratorio with solo and choral voices. And there was even a piano arrangement, which he apparently signed off on and authorized. And whatever your personal spiritual inclinations, it's a work of monumental power and beauty. And I think one that is just so desperately needed right now. And, okay, good. Almost to our last concert. We have now a Salon Concert in Hollis, which features my friend and colleague Olaf Chris Henriksen in an intimate program of Renaissance and Baroque solo music for the lute and the cousins of the lute. Chris is a highly acclaimed specialist of the arch lute and the theorbo and the Baroque guitar, and he's going to be performing and demonstrating several pre-classical plucked string instruments. I think it's going to be a very special evening. And our final village concert of the season is in Westmoreland. It's another string quartet concert, and we begin with the Beethoven String Quartet in C minor, Opus 18, number 4. And the Beethoven is very special to me because it's one of the very first string quartets I ever played. And it feels to me today both incredibly familiar and remarkably revolutionary, as Beethoven so often does. Beethoven gives a glimpse of the dramatic scope of this piece within the first 30 seconds or so, where he takes a fairly conventional classical gesture, played at the very bottom of the violin's register, and he weaves and builds the phrase through repetition and amplification higher and higher until it ends up 2 octaves higher in the most powerful register. The whole phrase encompasses just under 3 octaves. It's so good. Oh, I can't wait to play this while not being 14 years old. That's going to be, I think, for me, the most amazing part. And then we have Mario Davidovsky's Quartet number 6, subtitled Fragments. Davidovsky was an Argentine-American composer who just passed away less than a year ago. I think last August, maybe. He was well known for his work with electroacoustic music, but he also wrote a large body of non-electronic work, almost exclusively chamber music. And his 6th string quartet, Fragments, is an incredible tapestry of these microcosmic worlds that kind of morph in and out of reality, scurrying, fidgeting lines and pointillistic punctuations and moments of just sorrowful lyricism. It's a really extraordinary piece and one which I'm very excited about presenting. And the final piece on our summer lineup is César Franck's String Quartet in D major. Franck, that is César Auguste Jean Guillaume Hubert Franck, is a composer who in many ways began to find his voice quite late in his life. He wrote a few early compositions in his early life as a virtuoso pianist, which were, by the way, quite well received by none other than Franz Liszt. And midlife he dedicated himself to the organ, for which he wrote more or less exclusively. Then towards the end of his life he was a conservatory professor, and this is when most of his major large-scale works were written. There's a great story about one of these pieces, the piano quintet, which I will hope to share with you next season if all goes as planned. But the string quartet is his last completed chamber work, written actually in the year of his death in 1890, and it's broad and indulgent and rich and, maybe a little bit excessive and tremendous and just sadly not played very much now. It was also, by the way, by many accounts, his first public success as a composer during his life. Can you imagine that? 7 months before his death, this work was premiered to thunderous applause. Wow. And I can't wait to bring it to life in our community. So, oh my goodness, that's the season. And I've talked for so long. But, okay, there we go. Great. If anybody has any questions they'd like to ask me about literally anything, or if they just want to talk about anything. Andre says, of all these pieces, which one are you most excited about? Oh my goodness. I mean, I've expressed excitement for so many of them. That is such a good question. Hold on. I bet I can come up with an answer in just a minute. I don't know. I mean, there's so many things that, the best part of this job is listening to all this music and thinking, and thinking, oh, I love this piece and I just want to present it, and getting to know all these incredible pieces. I guess I would say I don't know, as I mentioned, I feel this kind of deep need to be living in the world of the Haydn right now, the Seven Last Words, because it's so beautiful and so remarkable. It's like this hour of just kind of unmodulated meditation, and then this kind of angry cry at the end. But also, I would say, sorry, I know dead time is not great. I don't know. There are a lot of little things like the Gata, which I just think is so gorgeous and so fun and so funny. I think maybe one of the pieces I'm most looking forward to also is the Bernard Herrmann, the clarinet quintet, which is just, if you know that world of his film writing, it's kind of like this beautiful, intimate sort of Hollywood sound, but I don't know, with this kind of edge, and it's also a piece where there's not a lot of sort of contrasting fast music in it. It's a lot of these sort of long, open, spacious lines, but it's so beautiful. Let's see, other comments. Oh, what is my favorite memory of Jim Boley? Well, this is kind of an embarrassing story actually, but my very first concert with Monadnock Music, I remember he called me one spring, and I was just kind of right out of college. Out of my continued college studies, out of my artist diploma at New England Conservatory, and so I didn't have a lot to do. I was kind of like many recent graduates, sitting around at home and waiting for the phone to ring, and he just kind of called me up and was like, "Oh, I'd love you to come in and play on our summer series," and I ended up playing on a couple concerts, and the first concert I was scheduled to play had a few pieces on it. It had the Beethoven Viola Quintet, which was the first time I'd ever heard that piece. I wasn't playing in it, but I got to listen, and so beautiful. And the piece I was playing on, I actually had only one piece on that program, which ended up being quite fortunate because of the way things turned out. But I was playing a duo for viola and cello by Franz Danzi, which is very charming, very kind of gallant, fun little piece. And my son was, I guess, just under a year old at that time. No, just over a year old. And I was driving back and forth between Boston and New Hampshire every day for rehearsal. And this was before I had any kind of GPS or anything like that, so I was just kind of taking the road up and down to New Hampshire that I knew. And it was all fine until the day of the concert, which was a Friday. And suddenly there was like tons of construction along the route. Like I was going up Route 3, I think, and it was just like a traffic jam for literally hours. And it took me, usually it's a 2-hour drive, and it took me 6 hours to get there. And I just remember this horrible feeling of being in the car and driving, and thinking like, okay, well, maybe I can make it for like the second half of the concert, or maybe I can make it for the end of the concert. And it was terrible. And I ended up getting there literally as the final moments of the Beethoven played. Like I was there for like the last 20 seconds of the concert. And of course, this is back then. I didn't have a cell phone. This was almost 20 years ago. And so, yeah, and I had no way of reaching people up kind of in the middle of rural New Hampshire, at least not one that I knew about. And so I came kind of, very quietly running into the back of the concert hall, and I actually didn't recognize Jim Boley. I don't think I had actually met him at that point. And I was also very, very flustered, and I was like, oh, can someone tell me where Jim Boley was? And he was sitting like right there in front of me. And I was, of course, very apologetic. And I was like, do you want me to play my piece now? And they just finished the Beethoven string quartet. And he was like, no, it's fine. And I thought, oh my gosh, like I am never going to work for this festival again. Like, that was it. And, it's funny because Jim had this reputation, which I think he also kind of fostered, of being sort of very gruff. And, he could certainly, with an orchestra, be very, what's a good way to put it? He could be very dramatic and, in some ways kind of abrasive, very, he yelled a lot. But he also was like, he had such an incredible love of music, and such a great love and respect for his musicians and his colleagues, even if it sometimes in large settings manifested in a slightly odd way. And he was so kind, and he he was just, he shrugged it off like it was nothing. I was like, just, show up tomorrow, it'll be fine. And I couldn't believe that. I still kind of can't believe it. And it's, again, still kind of a miracle to me that I am still here at Monadnock and wasn't fired that first day. Let's see. Oh, Glory, who is, I have to say, in full disclosure, my sister-in-law. So when can we expect a Rafi podcast? Probably never. But thank you. That is so sweet. Let's see. Well, it's been great getting to do this awkwardly at home in front of a blank screen for all of you wonderful people. And if anybody has any other questions or really just anything they want to say or anything they'd like to talk about, please write. But otherwise, yeah, we can continue this conversation at a later date. And again, it's really, the future of everything for the next 3 months or longer maybe, who knows, is so uncertain right now. But we are hoping to go ahead with as much of this as we possibly can. And we will keep you posted as we know more information. But I think, the most important thing to us is to stay really involved with our community in the safest way we possibly can. So in some way or another, we will see you as soon as we can, presenting what music we can. And I'm very much looking forward to it. Thank you for anyone and everyone who has joined us, and I am going to sign off for now. Have a wonderful and safe week. Stay safe and healthy, and I'll see you all soon. Thank you so much.